My name is Nicola Lemon. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Hume Community Housing, and I'm also the Chair of Power Housing Australia. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal clan of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, pay my respects to elders both past and present, and I wish to acknowledge and respect the continuing culture and contribution that they make to the life of this city and the region. So I'm really delighted to introduce our next keynote speaker. I'm hoping that you're really going to enjoy this. George Megalogenis is a journalist, author, documentary filmmaker, or as Annabelle Crabb puts it, Australia's best explainer. George has an illustrious career in the media, most notably a senior feature writer for The Australian. After 11 years in the Canberra Press Gallery, he's renowned as one of Australia's best political commentators. In recent years, George has written a number of very successful books, including The Australian Moment, which in 2013 won the Prime Minister's Literary Award for Non-Fiction, and in 2012, the Wakely Award for Non-Fiction. George joins us today to put those amazing explanatory skills to our sector as he takes a look at housing policy in Australia. Before George joins us on stage, may I take a very short moment again, as is the protocol, I believe, at the beginning of conference plenary sessions, to acknowledge some of the sponsors of this event. First of all, the official conference host partner is the New South Wales Department of Family and Community Services, the platinum partner, the National Affordable Housing Consortium, in partnership with Places for People, and the gold partners, PACE, who have delivered the very handy conference app, which again we'll be testing in this session, Fast Connect, who are the sponsor of all-important Networking Lounge, and Spotless, who proudly present the think tank. So thank you to all other conference sponsors and exhibitors. Your support, I believe, is critical to Ahuri and New South Wales FACS being able to deliver this important event. So in introduction to today's session, I'll be asking George to explore political and policy landscapes and draw on the lessons of the GFC to suggest some new ideas to deal with Australia's affordability crisis. I recently had the opportunity to present to the International Housing Partnership on the Australian housing landscape, and one of the notable things in that presentation was perhaps the shift in recognition of the issue by the media and therefore the general public of affordable housing. Did you know that in the first 6 months of this year, there were 564 reports per day across all forms of media on the affordable housing crisis in this country? As practitioners, we've talked about this for years. However, community attitudes have turned on their heads, and voters now consider the interests of renters and first home buyers to be more important than that of the interests of existing homeowners. So how can both sides of politics exploit this shift in policy? I'll welcome George to this stage.
Thank you, Nicola, and thank you to Ahuri for the invitation. This is the second time I've spoken at one of your conferences. The last time was in Brisbane in late 2012, in my final week as a journalist on The Australian. So this is me 5 years down the track, technically unemployed, but still been thinking about policy issues. Now, as Nicola flagged, the thing that's been interesting me, especially the last 12 months, when we look back to the federal election in 2016, Bill Shorten came up with a public policy at the beginning of that year on negative gearing, which in any other year in my sort of 30 years in journalism would have been a red flag for a political party, because you would have thought that the 65 to 70% of Australians who are either homeowners who had paid off their mortgage or were in the process of paying off their mortgage, that their interests would trump the interests of the person not yet in the market or the renter. And the reason why you would want to do a fix on negative gearing, of course, would be to tilt the playing field towards the person not in the market. Now, in any other year, that would have been the end of Bill Shorten as an opposition leader. And I know the Labor people were. Some of you in the room might know a bit more about the specific conversations, but I know the Labor Party at the time gulped when they announced the policy. They expected extraordinary pushback. What they actually got was a bump in the polls. What they found out later, when they checked with people who've been researching this in the field, unprompted, any group in Australia today, if you ask them in a focus group, what's your number one concern? They'll say housing affordability. Number one concern, unprompted. And this book's not for sale today, but for some of you, if you've seen Rebecca Huntley's book, Still Lucky, because Rebecca had been running the Mind and Mood survey for Hugh Mackay's organisation for 10 years, she's got a brilliant chapter in there explaining how this thing has changed. Now, I'll just give you a quick summary before I go to some policy detail, because I'll take you through a tour of political history of the last 20 years so we can track what's been changing in the marketplace that ultimately led to this literally inversion of public opinion. Now, as I said, it was a surprise to Bill Shorten last year that this idea on negative gearing was actually a vote winner. It's been there, I think, for about 5 years. So it's been there coming out of the GFC. And I'm going to now take a step back and take you through the steps. Some of you in the room will be very familiar with some of this detail. Others in the room would have been too young to remember some of this stuff. But there was a chap called Paul Keating who was Treasurer of Australia between 1983 and 1991 before he challenged for the Prime Ministership, lost the first ballot, went on the back bench for 6 months and then got the Prime Ministership at the second attempt. Some of you in the room will remember that he knocked off negative gearing in the mid-1980s. He said it was a rort, and it was one of the things that an open, competitive economy couldn't tolerate. Now, the language at the time when he did knock it off was that this was drawing investment into a dead sector, which was bricks and mortar, when what he wanted to do in those days through the reform program is unleash Australian creativity. Now, that particular policy lasted all of 2 years. The New South Wales state election in 1988 was the trigger for the reversal, i.e. the reintroduction of negative gearing. It didn't save Barry Unsworth's government, but it did have some consequences for the housing crisis we had in the late 1980s. The first of the snapshots, and this is a very interesting thing if you've dug through the tax stats, it's amazing how this story changes over time. 86-7, which was the clean year without negative gearing, just over 6% of individuals who lodged a tax return declared a rental income. Roll forward 10 years, roll forward to the mid-90s, to the last financial year that Paul Keating was Prime Minister, and that 6% figure has gone up to 11%. So that's where the big shift occurred. The investor class was unleashed when negative gearing came back on. And we know when we look at the numbers through the late 80s, you had, and you see it in the media at the time, the first complaint in the political space that investors were bumping out, were crowding out first home buyers. We had prices surging in 88 and 89 in the order of 20 and 30% a year. The bubble popped, there was a recession, and people didn't think about that again for a number of years. But in the intervening years, as I explained, we go from a position where 6% of taxpayers declare a rental income to 11%. Now that number just creeps up a percentage point every couple of years from then on. But the part of the story, and this is the part of the story, it's sort of my great regret as a journalist that I didn't even go harder at the time. Towards the end of the 90s, of course, we're doing the tax reform package with the GST as its centrepiece. Now the GST, when it was first presented to the voters in 1998, had everything in, taxed at 10%, and had tax cuts across the board but skewed to middle and higher income earners. The Australian Democrats, in the end, said that they wanted food out, and John Howard decided that the cost of removing food from the GST would be the trimming, not the reduction, not an absolute reduction, people still got a tax cut, but the trimming of the promised tax cuts to middle and higher income earners. Now, internally in the government at the time, there was a recognition that they'd shortchanged their voter. So just after they'd parked the GST concession with the Democrats, they started to look at something else that they could give that voter who'd been shortchanged in the negotiations with the Democrats. And they came up with the capital gains tax discount. Now, Paul Keating reintroduces negative gearing in the late 1980s. John Howard introduces a capital gains tax discount in September of 1999 at the same time that he's introducing a GST. This is the Keating-Howard legacy. The two dumbest things that each of them have done are these two policies together. Because what happened, as soon as negative gearing fused with the idea that a capital gains tax would be taxed at a concessional rate, the investor came back into the market. And in fact, the investor came back into the market in that 99, early 2000 period at such a rate that they brought forward literally a year's worth of building activity. People thought at the time that they were trying to avoid the GST on building materials. Basically, it was the fusing of capital gains tax and the already quite generous treatment on negative gearing to create an investment bonanza for about 9 months. Of course, once the GST came in, because all this activity had been brought forward, the economy crashed. Now, the economy crashed. We found this out in March of 2001, and John Howard panics, doubles the first homeowner grant to try and get the economy going again. Then we go from an investment surge to a first home buyer surge in 2001, and before you know it, Australia is racing ahead of the rest of the world with property prices, especially in Sydney, that are out of whack with any measure. Now, the Reserve Bank in those days could handle the pressure of the housing market or the stress that the housing market would put on the real economy. They were able to tweak interest rates back up again because they'd cut interest rates quite dramatically during the tech wreck and the September 11 incident in 2001. So up they went in 2002 and again in 2003. Mind you, at this point, no other central bank in the world was tightening monetary policy. Out there in voter land, people became very stressed about, they called it mortgage stress. In the 2004 election, again, I'm giving you a very, very short, it's taken a bit longer than I probably intended, but political history here. In 2004, that was the day we knew at the ballot box that day that you couldn't do anything at the time to upset the mortgage belt. Now, 12 seats changed hands in that election. This is the most fascinating election I've ever covered. In 2004, Mark Latham picked up 4 seats off the government. But the government picked up 8 off Labor. The 8 that they picked up off Labor, and this is a long-term government, by the way, this is the last time a federal government in Australia has been re-elected with an increased majority. They got +4, 8 minus 4. The 8 seats that they won, and a lot of them they hadn't targeted, they just turned up for them, they sort of fell in their lap, were in the mortgage belt, where the proportion of voters with a mortgage was above the national average, and the national average at that point was about 26.5%. So in the mortgage belt, the idea that Mark Latham would become Prime Minister and interest rates might go up by another 1/4 percentage point was enough to re-elect a government. Now, I think it is to the sort of political journalists' regret that that election became, and I think a lot of political operatives as well thought that that was the last will and testament of the Australian electorate, that they'd never want to be disturbed again on housing policy. Now, as I flagged at the start, something changed with the GFC. Now, the thing that's changed since the GFC, the thing that would make a repetition of what happened in 2004 almost impossible, is the elevation in prices in especially Melbourne and Sydney. Now, I'm just going to give you a couple of numbers just a reminder. This is just established prices the last 5 years. And I'll remind you of what the Reserve Bank hasn't been able to do in the last 5 years. It's been forced to continue to cut interest rates since about 2011. It's obviously held them steady for the last 2 years because the rest of the world was at near zero. Now, in the last 5 years, in annual terms, and this is just for the sale of established houses, 16% a year increase in Sydney, 12% a year increase in Melbourne, 5 in Brisbane, 4 in Adelaide, 1 in Perth. In fact, the only other two capital cities, and it's actually been falling in annual terms, marginally by 0.7% in Darwin. The only other two cities that are recording relatively healthy price growth are Hobart and Canberra, both at 5.6% a year. Now, at the end of this presentation, I'm going to come to some migration statistics that might explain some of those numbers. Now, I haven't gone all Andrew Bolt on you, but I will explain how migration has fed into that price story. Now, since about 2008, and certainly since 2011-12, people with mortgages, people without them, are unifying on this one idea, that the next generation of Australians can't afford to live where they are working. Now, you're well aware of the affordability issue at the very bottom end of the market, for people in need of crisis accommodation, for people at the margins. Middle Australia, and as I say, this is the reason why opinions have been turned on their heads. Middle Australia, even if they're in the market, worry about their kids. Now, one of the reasons they need to worry about their kids is what the investor has been doing in the last 5 to 10 years. Now, let's go to 2001 and remind ourselves what happened the year after the introduction of the GST and the capital gains tax discount. We've got just under 13% of all taxpayers declaring a rental income. That year, they weren't that good as investors. They lost between them $800 million. It's the biggest single loss that we had on the books and the tax stats up to this point. Now, the losses multiplied through the salad days of the Howard government during the first phase of the mining boom. 2007-8, Howard's final year as Prime Minister, 13.5%. Now note, the proportion hasn't gone up by much. 13.5% of taxpayers are declaring a rental income. The net loss, does anyone remember the number? Because it's such a big number. It was $9 billion that tax year. $9 billion. So they weren't buying for the yield, they were buying for the capital gain. So when we look at the home ownership number, and there's a really big switch in around that period. Proportion own outright, proportion borrowing. You know that the line's changed. 10 percentage points switch from owning home outright to being borrowers again. That's the group that during this period decided to become property investors. And they borrowed again and again and again. And I'm not going to knock them, but this is the group we need to think about in a public policy sense. If these house prices that I just mentioned are signs of a bubble in Melbourne and Sydney, whether they fizz or pop, at some point we're going to need to think about what to do with that investor class, the people who are carrying assets that they won't be able to sell in a downturn, may have bought an apartment or two through self-managed super. Whether there's a systems risk for the banking industry or not, I'm not so sure about the Big Four. I think the Big Four might be able to survive. But there are other parts of the financial system that will be very exposed very quickly if the price story turns the other way. Now, obviously, when prices do start to fall, affordability is less of an issue. But we know from past evidence what happens is that the first-time buyer will hang back and wait and wait and wait, because if sentiment changes, they tend to wait a few years before they re-enter the market. Now, the last financial year we have, tax stats for 2014-15, 15.5% of all taxpayers, it's 1 in 7, have an investment property declaring a rental income. The net loss was actually not that bad. It was $3.3 billion, so a third or 2/3 less than it was in 2007-8 at that sort of peak of the investment mania. But here's another thing to think about. All the way through the 90s, it was about 50-50. 50% of investors declared a rental profit, 50% declared a rental loss. At the peak of the boom, 70% were declaring losses, and now we're down to 60%. This is of the entire investor class. Now, some of you may be very familiar with the detail of this data, but this is the systems risk. The reason this is a systems risk, and the reason why I don't want to send you home with homework or anything, the reason why I want you to think about how do we anticipate a cooling in the market or even a bursting of a bubble, if it is a bubble. What do you tell government to do with that investor? What do you do? Now, I can suggest a couple of things, but I might throw to the questions later. Now, in 2004, it's such an interesting year, 2004, because whilst there was a whole lot of activity going on in the public space, a whole lot of money was being thrown at voters. Privately, the Treasury, and a few of you will be aware of this now because it was a centrepiece of the documentary I did a couple of years ago, the Treasury were worried. We hadn't had a recession at that point for 13 years. And they looked around the room, Ken Henry and Martin Parkinson looked around the room at one strategic meeting and realised that they were the only two who were in the Treasury during the last recession. So what they did was they started to war game what sort of advice you give. They didn't tell Peter Costello they were doing this because he probably would have shut it down for fear of the thing leaking. What would you do in the event of a downturn? What sort of advice would you give government? Now we know in 2008 that was waiting there when the GFC came. Basically put $10 billion on the table for households to put a floor under the economy. But what would you advise a government in the event of a housing crash? This is a different question to an external shock like a GFC bringing on a recession or the fear of a recession. What would you advise a government? If you're in a state government, who would you talk to in the state government to ask them about the experience, say, in Victoria during 88 and 92, when you had collapse in property prices, 13% unemployment, and for a couple of years net emigration, more people leaving Victoria than coming to it? What would you advise them? Most people in most state government departments, premiers, Treasury, or wherever else housing policy might reside, most of them will be too young to remember the tech wreck, which was a soft landing for our economy. A few of them will remember the GFC, but none of them will remember the late 80s and early 90s. So what would you advise them? I think there are three things to think about, and it doesn't hurt to be brave about these things, because in the event of a catastrophe, the first thing a minister wants to hear is a bright idea. They don't want to hear, I didn't predict this, I'm sorry, this shouldn't have happened. It's what a lot of people do say when a number goes south when they're continually predicting growth. Now, as I said, I'm worried about a particular group of homeowners, investors. And I'm worried about this particular group because they're nearing retirement. They're holding stock, which they are going to want to offload in the event of a downturn, but they're not going to be able to sell it. They're renting to somebody who may, if you trick up the system, may be able to buy it off their landlord. But it may well be that a government might need to intervene, might actually intervene in a way that we did in 2008 when we put $10 billion on the table to indemnify the consumer against the GFC, which was going to have knock-on effects obviously for retailers and eventually for the construction sector. It may be that the government needs to think about bailing out. Now, I don't know what the detail is, I just want to put the thought out there because I think what you need to think about is the day the crisis comes, the number of people that are affected are always a multiple of what the initial forecast is. One of the things they found when they were wargaming the recession in that 2004 period, they looked back on all the forecasts they did through the late 80s, early 90s, and they kept expecting that episode would be a normal episode. Okay, we missed the turn in the economy, but it's going to come back. It didn't come back. It didn't come back for a number of years. So if there's a hole in the real economy brought on by a property bubble, it'd be a number of years before you'll be able to get growth going again. Now that's the macro story, but the micro story, and this is a very important story for people at the edge of the market, if a bailout, if some sort of intervention can assist the person who otherwise fall completely off the cliff, not just the investor, but the person it's almost a matchmaking stimulus operation here I'm thinking about. Government be able to find some way to house people who, in a downturn, are not going to be able to be housed. We're not going to have the means to house themselves. Now, I'm just going to leave that out there because I think that is one of the things to think about. In the event of a downturn, how do we respond? Now, I did say I wanted to talk about migration. Now, I want to talk about migration because this is the big story in Australia today. This is the big population story in Australia today. House prices are an echo of a much bigger story. Now, all the way from the end of the Second World War to the turn of the 21st century, we had a pretty simple understanding of what the migration program did. We'd bring in about 80 or 100,000 a year. It's about 1 million people net over the course of each decade, the 50s, the 60s, fewer in the 70s, 80s and 90s. Now that extra 1 million a decade that we added to the population was a bit below 50% of total population growth because fertility was adding a bit over 1 million. So we're making more babies than we're importing people. Through the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s and 90s, now my parents' story is probably very similar to a lot of people who are second generation here. They started at the bottom. You measured their achievement via small business or home ownership, and you measured the Australian-born kids' achievement via university and sort of professional achievement. Now in those days, because it was a two-generation story, there was never any question of the loyalty of either the first or the second generation, the new arrival or the Australian-born sons and daughters with at least one migrant who were a parent. Now in those days we were a minority. Today, just under half the total population of Australia is either first or second generation. 28% born overseas, 21% Australian-born with at least one parent who's a migrant. Now, bear in mind that first number, 80 to 100,000 a year, consistently over the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s. About 2/3 unskilled or blue collar or family reunion. Since the turn of the 21st century, that's been flipped on its head. We've actually increased the intake. We're now at just under 190 a year, and of that 190, 70% are skilled. So the net addition of about 100,000 people a year, another billion, I said, I didn't mean to say billion, I'm definitely becoming Andrew Bolt now, sorry. Another 1 million a decade are skilled. They're not starting where my mum and dad started, they're starting here, towards the top of the ladder. Now one of the reasons we need them, and we need them in big numbers, is that the economy's been running, firing on all cylinders, for 27 years without the interruption of a deep recession. There's not that much spare capacity in the local-born labour market. The population is ageing, so if you take migration, and this is the way to understand it, if you take migration to zero tomorrow, just as a thought experiment, the people leaving the labour market, retiring, wouldn't be, within a year, wouldn't be replaced by new entrants from the local-born population. You'd actually go into decline for the labour market within a year. You go into absolute population decline by about 2040. That's if you had net migration at zero. No one's recommending that, but a lot of people are recommending a dramatic reduction in migration, and I did hear a certain former Prime Minister suggest that, to cool the housing market, you would halve migration. Now, what would actually happen if you even halve migration is you'd crash the economy, and you'd get a good affordability story, but with nobody with a job to be able to buy a cheaper house. So I'm going to park that thought to one side. I don't think that it's a very constructive thought. But the thing I want to walk you through is where the migrants in Australia today live. And I'm going to begin not in Melbourne or Sydney. I'm going to begin in Newcastle, which is the most Australian part of our cities and towns. It is the only city or town where the top 5 migrants are in the same order as the nation as a whole. The English number 1, New Zealanders number 2, Chinese number 3, Indians number 4, Philippines number 5. Now in terms of skill sets, the Chinese and Indians are the ones to watch. Now, I said 28% of Australia's overseas born. In Newcastle, the figure is only 12%. So even though they've got the ethnic face of Australia in their local community, it's off a much lower base. It's just an accident of geography or history that they've got the same top 5 as the nation. If you head north to the Gold Coast looks like no other part of Australia. Not in a bad way. The reason why they actually can't get a footy team or a rugby league team to feature prominently in either of those competitions is very transient population. 30% born overseas. The number one group, just under 9% of the entire population, are the New Zealand born. The English are number 2, the Chinese are number 3, South Africans are number 4, and the Indians are number 5. When you get to Brisbane, you get to the first capital city in Australia with someone other than the English as the number 1 migrant group, and that is the New Zealand born. By the time you get to the Sunshine Coast, you're at the whitest part of Australia, and it happens very quickly as you go up the eastern seaboard. Top immigrant group, the English, Kiwis number 2, South Africans number 3, Germans number 4, and Americans are number 5. Now, I don't know which president they were fleeing, Bush, Obama or Trump, or maybe all of the above. I expect that number will actually rise. Indians aren't in the top 5, they're 7th. The Chinese aren't in the top 10, they're 11th. So you're looking at it's quite a vibrant property market, but it's retirees essentially. Now, Australia starts to get very diverse the further north you get. By the time you get to Darwin, you get to the first capital city that has an Asian immigrant group as the largest community, and that's the Philippine-born. Flip over to Perth, the English-born are number 1, and the proportion of English in Perth is actually higher today than it was during the White Australia period. It's just under 10% of the entire population. Adelaide's still got the English at number 1, and now the interesting part of the story. Now, I did mention that there were 4 cities. 2 were very, very hot property markets, another 2 were pretty good property markets, which were Hobart and Canberra. Hobart is the first place to look to see what skilled migration is doing to an otherwise very white part of Australia. The Chinese-born are number 2 in Hobart, and on present trends will overtop the English-born within a decade, within 10 years. Hobart having the Chinese-born as the number 1 migrant group. In Melbourne today, it's the Indians 1, the Chinese 2, and the English 3. In Canberra, the Chinese and Indians are racing each other to see who'll be number 1, and that'll happen very soon. By the next census, one of them will be 1, the other will be 2, and the English will be 3. And we know in Sydney that the Chinese born by a long way are the largest migrant community in Sydney. 75% of all Chinese born in Australia live in just those 2 capital cities, Melbourne and Sydney. 64% of all the Indian born live in just those 2 capital cities, Melbourne and Sydney. Chinese and Indians are a proxy for skilled migrant. Chinese and Indians, and it's not just Chinese and Indians, the Brits who live in Melbourne and Sydney, the South Africans who live in Melbourne and Sydney, the Philippines who live in Melbourne and Sydney are better educated than any other group from their community in any other part of Australia. These 2 cities, and the housing market is a bit of a warning that it's probably moving a bit too quickly, but other things being equal, would you rather be Melbourne or Sydney or the Sunshine Coast? You actually want to be drawing the energy, but you want to be planning for it better. And you want to be aware of the housing choices of a lot of skilled migrants. Skilled migration, and there are a lot of planning departments in Australia that will be tearing their hair out when it occurs to them, that skilled migration actually increases density and sprawl in a capital city. Because not all want to live in apartment towers in the city. Some of the groups don't mind living on greenfield sites in the outer suburbs. Now, public policy hasn't had to think about migration for a long time, because the thing that used to freak policymakers out was Hanson Mark 1, are we going to be talked into cutting the program against our national interests? We don't need to worry about that anymore, because we run a demand-driven program. Business, government as an employer, pretty much decides who comes to this country. But as I said, the labour market, and this is a function of 27 years of growth and a bit of ageing, the local-born labour market is at full capacity. There's not that much spare capacity left. To keep the place ticking over, you are going to need to import, and I don't mean that in a pejorative. As a son of migrants, I'm quite pumped about the success of the migration program, and I've written a piece to the New York Times the other year explaining why we've probably got the roll gold model in this day and age of Brexit and Trump. But we're having to bring in 180, 190,000 a year, but we know that they just cluster in Melbourne and Sydney. We know the story in Melbourne and Sydney is ground zero for the affordability problem in Australia. We know that there is political permission to do something about that. We also know that there's a risk in and around electorates in Queensland and WA that the backlash to migration sooner or later will incentivise one of the major parties, no names, to run a bit more of an anti-migration program whilst running an open model. Now, this is a debate for another time, but whilst we're thinking about interventions in the housing market in the event, likely or unlikely, of a housing crash, let's imagine the other part of the story, that there's another 5 years to go and we go into our fourth decade of uninterrupted growth. We're at 30, 31, 32 years. One of the big stories, if we haven't got our heads around it by then, should be decentralisation. So when I look at, and I'm very mindful of the fact because it's got the 5-minute warning earlier, when I look at housing policy today, when I look at the conversation that the electorate is willing to permit, and I look at the political class and I still see them a bit hesitant, the thing I try to remind them, and I just gave a private presentation the other week to the public service about this, the migration story is going to force them to intervene, to reactivate government, to make sure that the benefits are shared. The danger, if you continue to concentrate growth in just 2 cities via the migration program, and you crowd out your middle class. Now, these aren't the only 2 cities in the world where this is happening. There are some cities who are many years advanced down this track. And we know in the US, when you look at who voted for Hillary Clinton and you looked at who voted for Donald Trump, Clinton's supporters are in the part of the US on the east and the west coast that are comfortable with globalisation. Trump's supporters were in the part of the US that are uncomfortable with globalisation. Now, it used to be the case, and this is quite an interesting piece of data, I will dig it up to make sure I've quoted it accurately for you. It used to be the case at a presidential election, if it was close, because that last one was close, that the proportion of counties voting Democrat and the proportion of counties voting Republican, when you totaled up the contribution to GDP of each of those counties, you get about 50-50, which was the story in 2000, Al Gore versus George W. Bush. At that last general election in 2016, Hillary Clinton's counties accounted, sorry about the alliteration, the counties that voted for Hillary Clinton contributed 64% of US GDP. 2/3 of the income story in the US picked the loser of the election. Trump's counties, 36%. And by the way, he had 2,584 vote for him and only 472 vote for Hillary Clinton. Now, the reason why, and bear in mind I'm pro-migration, the reason why I want people to think about migration and housing policy together is I don't want to see 5 years from now that debate, which is the people who've been, so this isn't even an affordability issue, this is an access to the middle. So the parts of Australia that are flat or going backwards, regional Queensland, sort of ex-mining boom WA, South Australia generally, not Hobart. Hobart's okay, Canberra's okay, Melbourne's okay, Sydney's okay. Have a think about what happens to the electoral map when you get such a separation 5 years from now. It can start to look, I don't think you'll get as catastrophic a candidate as Trump in Australia because we've got a compulsory preferential voting system, so it would have been hard on the vote he got last year to actually win a federal election. But think about the noise and public policy you'll be getting then. You'll be getting a lot of reactive knee-jerk stuff. And think about also what the Trump versus Clinton divide, economic divide, is really about. There's one part of America who I wouldn't say not contributing, but more likely than not to be on welfare, and another part earning pretty big salaries. This is quite a generalisation, but think about what your budget looks like, what your national budget looks like. When a Sydney or Melbourne continue to keep a Victorian or New South Wales government in decent surplus because of stamp duty, you've got big debts in Queensland and WA, and you've got a federal government in deficit because it hasn't got its tax system sorted out. How is it possible 5 or 10 years from now to hold that country together, especially when it looks so different in the southeast corner compared to the rest of the country? I think there's a lot of things to be concerned about, but that's why I don't want to, as I say, send you all homework assignment, but I think you need to think a little more proactively about what sort of advice or what sort of public policy intervention, and we are talking intervention. So when a market ceases to function, when an economy heads south, when a housing market, when a bubble pops, governments are going to want to know how to fix it. So that's the time, I think, to think about the big transactions. I mean, mistakes can be made. We know from the last round of stimulus, we know the second wave of stimulus and the school building and especially the pink bats. It was quite a diabolical intervention from the federal government. But that doesn't mean that doing nothing is an option. The history of the late 80s, early 90s is doing nothing actually made the recession a lot deeper. That was the advice at the time, very economically rational. You can only cause more harm by intervening. The Treasury no longer believe that. I know state governments no longer believe that. But remember, most state governments are peopled by very, very good young advisors who would barely remember the tech wreck, let alone the recession of the late 80s, early 90s. I'll leave that as my sort of take-out thought and encourage some questions, and we will have a chance to chat again after 5 o'clock at the get-together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, George. Fascinating. So we've got the opportunity through the app to do about 5 to 10 minutes of questions, and we've also got a roving mic. So the first question that we have, George, if we need to bail out heavily indebted investors, should we subsidise first homeowners to buy their properties? Have governments buy them as social housing, or both? Okay, so I had about 3 ideas on the page, and as I say, I didn't want to recommend, I just wanted to bring you to the possibility that we need to think about these things. A combination of both, but I think you need to test, you need to model it, and you need to actually ask who you want the winner to be. Mm-hmm. A bailout, the reason why you want to bail out the investor, but it may not be a direct bailout, is you don't want the financial system to collapse. Mm-hmm. So it may be the renter should be able to buy the property. That obviously implies another first home owner type subsidy. But then again, the investor might see the first home owner grant as putting a floor under capital prices. They may not want to release the market may not want to release the property to the market. I'd be surprised if it was an either or. I think depending on the market, sort of depending on the region, I think you probably will need at some point a government to be able to literally take the housing stock off their hands. If you just think about, again, I'm going to give you a big, broad macro concept here. Most years when the IMF look at the Australian economy and they take their soundings from the Treasury and the like, they say, weathered the GFC brilliantly, the fiscal story is pretty good, could do tax reform, Sydney, Melbourne property prices overvalued, and you're carrying too much household debt, as in a macro sense. Now, when I think intervention, what I'm actually thinking in a transactional sense is that some of that household debt, which probably shouldn't have been in the hands of the households, comes back to the one balance sheet that could probably cope with it, which is probably the government balance sheet. I don't like the idea of a Reserve Bank
bailing out individual investors, because I think you get some rorting very quickly. So it may be on balance that the renter would have the incentive. So in a sense, you're relying more often than not on some sort of market transaction as opposed to just a blank cheque.
And the community housing industry could play a part.
Yeah,
in
no,
that
I think that's...
potentially.
So this is the other thing. So if you have a particular idea, and if you can fund it yourself without asking the government to do it, I would recommend, as I say, I'd recommend some wargaming. Not because it might happen tomorrow, but you don't want to be surprised if something bad happens.
Great, thank you. Another question, you've spoken about the mood of the voters. So Liberal policy narrative is economic productivity, ALP running with inequality, which is likely to play best in the electorate given the mood shift you've identified.
Yeah, I think we've probably already seen a number of examples where the inequality story is resonating in Australia. Now, it's means and ends. The Turnbull agenda is about trusting the market to do this. Now, I actually think, and I think what happened last year was pretty unfortunate for Malcolm Turnbull. I think he wanted to do something on negative gearing, and I think that sort of decision coming from a Liberal government is more credible in a sort of a national unifying sense. If that side thinks there's something wrong and they're doing something to their voter, people tend to view that sort of reform as national interest reform. You know, in the same way that Labor bashed the unions on the head in the 80s. Part of the real wage, social wage trade-off was that unions didn't ask for as much in the 80s as they did in the 70s in terms of wages. So I think the inequality story is the stronger story. But I think what went wrong early last year was that they had a look at negative gearing, short and beaten to the punch, and then the thing that kicked in, and this is the thing that I see across federal and state government, is really, to be honest, I know state government reps in the room, the most annoying thing in public life in the last 10 years is if one side comes up with an idea, even identifies the problem, the other side feels duty-bound on behalf of their base to pretend that this isn't the issue that you should be talking about. So we've had these awful binaries now in ACT and in Victoria where it's road or rail, or road or light rail in the ACT sense. And for the life of me, I can't understand why you would go into an election offering to undo a project to then put your, in an either-or sense. So I think negative gearing was a bit of a victim to that sort of thinking. Yeah. It's a shame that they haven't had a go at it, because anything to take the pressure out of the bubble popping. Now, I'm not saying that there is a bubble, but, you can't keep rolling the dice, I think. If you're talking about 18% a year for 5 years in Sydney and a bit less than 16 in Melbourne, must assume something is going to give.
And you talked interestingly about the historical power that the mortgage belt have held and probably continue to hold, and the crisis around affordability in housing has been generally because the children of those mortgage belt holders have been impacted.
So this really is the key change. So I suspect, without getting into the head of any individual voter, because you can only generalise based on what occurs in the focus groups. So they will nominate housing affordability. They wouldn't have been talking about housing affordability in the way they talk about it, say, 10 or 15 years ago. They'd have been talking about cost of living pressure. Because remember, the cost of living thing was around 07, 08, 09. They're not talking about that anymore. They obviously worry about energy prices. They're actually fearful for the future. And I think people are extrapolating on behalf of their kids, even though they're already in the market and they feel like they're winners. There's a very interesting intergenerational story going on here. I think they're also fearful for those who are extended, carrying a few too many investment properties. Yeah. I think they're also fearful for self and would like the government to do something to be able to take the heat out of the market for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Any questions from the audience?
Thank you, George. Thank you for your inspiring talk. Tony De Domenico from Uhuru. God forbid, let's assume we've got a visionary leader in our midst somewhere, and they would come up to you today and say, listen, I hear what you're saying. Okay, what advice are you prepared to give me today to stop the bubble from bursting in 5 years' time, or to make people more comfortable in 5 years' time? What's the couple of things that you do right now that mightn't be popular with my particular party, whichever it is, but what's the best advice you could give me?
Well, I'd be thinking big, because if you've asked me, I'd have to sack myself the next day, because politicians can't just go to the people with the, here's what you're going to have to give up. I think they need to think in the tax reform space. And I think tax reform in net terms has to take money off people for budgetary reasons as well as any other reason. It can't do it immediately. But you do something on negative gearing, but you'd also, you wouldn't necessarily remove the discount to capital gains. You might want to equalise it. So if you're doing negative gearing and your capital gains discount becomes the new rate for all investments, and I can tell you a lot of officials, when you prod them privately, say we have to get Australians off this idea that the only way to make money is through bricks and mortar. Now that's been in the DNA for a long time. But some of these numbers I quoted to you earlier, this is something that's accelerated with the opening of the economy. So there's sort of a prior assumption that you should own your own home. It then became own my own home plus a few others as a retirement income transaction or play. So I'd be looking at negative gearing and capital gains, but I'd be looking at them in the context of tax reform. So there has to be some trade-offs there. The other thing is I'd almost redefine the budget. And I know they've sort of started down this path, but I think you just need to declare it. You need to tell the people of Australia that the bit that's borrowing is really about infrastructure. And one of the reasons we're going hell for leather on infrastructure for the next few years is that we don't want Melbourne and Sydney to get to 8 million each. And in fact, I'd have that as the headline. The people of Melbourne and Sydney would be quite happy with that idea. So you're running a decentralisation story, which means not necessarily a super fast train track which will never get built up the eastern seaboard. It means connecting a Sydney to a Newcastle. One of the reasons why I mentioned Newcastle at the start, Sydney is just under 40% born overseas and another 25 second generation. 2/3 of Sydney are first or second generation. Newcastle is about a quarter, not 2/3, a quarter, the 12% plus maybe another 10 second generation. The last time a Sydney or a Melbourne had that ethnic mix was the 1870s. So we're in epic territory at the moment. Now, and it's concentrating. So the big story, the big thing you'd want to be taking to the people of Australia, and a state government will want to be doing it to take it to the regions, is that these two cities shouldn't get that much bigger anytime soon, and we should be able to share it. So I'd be looking at decentralisation, a decentralisation agenda with a really, really big infrastructure budget. This is why I'm not in public life. This is crazy, okay? And the other thing is I'd go hard on a tax reform package. So you're really talking about two sides, two parts of the budget. You're talking about the investment side of your budget, and you're talking about your current budget at the same time.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, George. I think
You're
that's it.
welcome.
If we could give George a hand, please.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.